Clara stood at the window, the early morning light filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. The house was quiet, except for the soft sounds of Sophie's breathing as she slept in her room upstairs. But Clara wasn't focused on the peaceful moment. Her mind was elsewhere, stuck in a memory that still haunted her after all these years. The memory played out like a movie reel in her mind, bright, vivid, painful. It was the day Sophie was born, the day that was supposed to be the happiest day of Clara's life. She had expected joy, relief, and the warmth of new motherhood. But instead, the words that echoed in her ears had shattered everything. "I don't want either of you. She's not mine." Clara could still feel the sting of those words as if they were etched into her soul, burning every ounce of hope and leaving behind only cold, raw emptiness. Lucas, her husband, the man she had loved, the man she had trusted, had walked out of that hospital room and out of their lives. Without so much as a second glance, he had left her, broken and alone with their newborn daughter, Sophie. She had always thought that the love they shared would weather any storm. She had believed that no matter what happened, they would face it together. But when Lucas had turned his back on her and Sophie, it felt like the ground had slipped out from beneath her feet. The man she had once believed would be her partner in everything, her confidant, her support, had chosen to walk away, leaving her in the harshest moment of her life. Sophie's cries had filled the room, and Clara had held her close, trying to soothe the newborn in her arms. But all she could feel was the heavy weight of betrayal pressing down on her chest. That day, in the quiet of the hospital room, Clara made a vow. She would not let this break her. She would not let Lucas's cruel rejection define her, or Sophie. They would survive. And, despite everything, they would thrive. Reflection on past pain. 15 years had passed since that fateful day, but Clara still carried the pain, even though it had changed over the years. It had hardened into something more resilient, something that no longer took away her breath. But it was still there, lingering in the background, like a scar that could never fully fade. As she sat in the living room, her gaze drifting from the window to the photographs of Sophie on the wall, Clara couldn't help but think about how much had changed, how much she had changed. Back then, she had been consumed by the ache of Lucas's rejection, by the disbelief that the man who had once promised to love and care for her and their child had so easily turned away. But now Clara was different. Sophie had grown into a fierce, intelligent young woman, full of promise and hope for the future. And Clara had found herself again. Stronger, more determined, and, most importantly, no longer defined by the past. It wasn't easy. Raising Sophie as a single mother had been nothing short of challenging, but Clara had always believed in the power of perseverance. She had made it through sleepless nights, financial struggles, and moments of doubt. But through it all, Clara had learned that nothing, no matter how painful, could ever take away the love she had for Sophie. And that love was the fuel that had kept her going. Yet, even after all this time, those words from Lucas still haunted her. "She's not mine, and I don't want either of you." They had followed her through the years, like a shadow, lingering just behind her shoulder. But now, after all the heartache, Clara knew that those words were nothing more than the hollow lies of a man too weak to face the truth that he had abandoned them, and in doing so, had given Clara the strength to build a life they both deserved. The twist: Lucas returns. The sound of the doorbell snapped Clara out of her thoughts, her heart skipping a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone, no friends, no family. The house was quiet, just the way she liked it. But then the doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. Clara stood up, her breath catching in her throat. She moved toward the door, confusion swirling in her mind. Who could it be? She wondered. It was far too early for anyone to be visiting. She opened the door slowly, the cool morning air rushing in as she looked up. Standing before her, looking as worn and broken as she had ever seen him, was Lucas. His hair had grayed at the temples, and his once sharp features were now softened by time, but there was no mistaking him. This was the man who had walked out on her, who had abandoned their daughter without a second thought. And yet, here he stood, looking at her with a mixture of desperation and regret in his eyes. "Clara," he said, his voice hoarse. But Clara didn't wait for him to finish. Why now? She thought. After all this time, after everything she had fought for, why was he standing there, asking for forgiveness? Clara crossed her arms over her chest, her gaze cold. She was no longer the woman who had begged him to stay all those years ago. She was stronger now, and she wasn't about to let his sudden appearance unravel the life she had built. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the whirlwind of emotions rising within her. Lucas hesitated, his eyes flicking down to the ground before meeting her gaze once more. I made a mistake. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But please, Clara, I need to explain." Clara's heart raced. Part of her wanted to slam the door in his face and never think about him again. But another part of her, the part that had been buried for so long, wanted to hear what he had to say. What could possibly make him think he could waltz back into her life after everything? Before she could respond, a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Mom." Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs, her eyes widening when she saw the man standing at the door. Clara turned to look at her daughter, her heart aching. Sophie had been only a baby when Lucas had left. She barely had any memory of him, and Clara had worked hard to protect her from the pain of knowing the truth. Now, standing there, Sophie looked at Lucas with a mix of curiosity and confusion. It was clear she didn't recognize the man who had once called himself her father. But Clara could see the silent question in her daughter's eyes. "Who is this man?" Clara glanced back at Lucas, her voice hardening. "You have exactly 2 minutes to tell me why you're here. After that, I don't want to see you again." Lucas nodded, his face drawn in anguish, as he began to speak, finally revealing the reasons behind his actions all those years ago. The pain of that day in the hospital never truly left Clara. It was etched in her mind, carved into her heart, like a scar that no amount of time could erase. The joy of giving birth to Sophie, the little girl who was the very embodiment of love and hope, had quickly turned to ashes, disintegrating under the weight of Lucas's words. She had expected him to be there, by her side, as they welcomed their daughter into the world. Instead, she was met with an accusation, a cruel dismissal, and a departure that shattered her trust in everything she thought she knew. Clara remembered the early hours of labor vividly, the pain, the anticipation, and the soft, reassuring words Lucas had whispered to her in between each contraction. She had believed those words. She had believed in him. She had believed in their future. But when the sun began to set, and Sophie was placed in her arms for the first time, Clara's world tilted. At 7:43 p.m., Sophie had entered the world, her tiny cry breaking the silence of the room. The nurses moved around Clara, cleaning Sophie gently and wrapping her in a soft, pink blanket. She was perfect. Every inch of her was a miracle. Clara's heart swelled with a love so fierce it nearly overwhelmed her. She looked up at Lucas, expecting to share this moment of sheer joy, to see his eyes light up with the same pride she felt. But instead he stood there, frozen. His expression was distant, cold, a stark contrast to the warmth she had seen in his eyes just hours before. It felt as though the air itself had thickened, a heavy silence settling between them like a wall. Clara held Sophie tighter, as though the newborn's small form could offer her some protection from the emptiness that Lucas's gaze now held. And when he spoke, his words sliced through her like a blade. "I've been going through your phone," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "I saw your messages with James." Clara's breath caught in her throat. James Cooper, her mentor, the man who had guided her career with nothing but the utmost professionalism. But Lucas had twisted it, warped it into something ugly, something he could use to justify what he was about to say next. "She's not mine," he muttered, his words calculated, sharp. "And I don't want either of you." Felt like the floor beneath her cracked open. Clara didn't have the words to respond. Instead, she could only watch as Lucas turned on his heel and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the sterile silence. The finality of it all left Clara numb. She sat there, holding Sophie, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The love of her life, the man she had trusted above all others, had just abandoned them. Without a second glance, without a shred of regret. The hours that followed blurred into an endless cycle of tears and disbelief. Nurses hovered around her, offering comfort that felt empty, hollow. Dr. Rebecca Chin, the pediatrician who had been assigned to Sophie, stayed past her shift, her presence a silent reassurance. She held Clara's hand, offering quiet words of support. But Clara couldn't bring herself to believe that anything would be okay. Not after this. And then Mary, her best friend, arrived, having driven through the night after she couldn't get a hold of Lucas. She walked into the room, took one look at Clara's face, and without a word, climbed into the bed beside her, careful not to disturb the IVs and the machines that beeped softly in the background. She simply held Clara as she cried, letting the tears fall without judgment, without the need for words. As the night stretched on, Clara found herself alone with Sophie in the quiet of the hospital room. The rhythmic sound of the machines, the soft whir of the ventilator, filled the silence as she stared at her daughter. Sophie slept peacefully, unaware of the storm that had just torn through their lives. Clara couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for the girl who would never know the love of her father, at least, not in the way a daughter should. But as Clara watched Sophie's chest rise and fall, something shifted inside her. The ache in her heart slowly morphed into something stronger. It wasn't bitterness that filled her. It was determination. This wasn't going to break her. It wasn't going to break Sophie. She made a vow to herself, silently but firmly. They would not just survive this. They would thrive. Sophie deserved better than a mother who crumbled in the face of betrayal. She deserved a warrior, someone who could face the darkness and rise above it. And that was exactly what Clara would become. By morning, the sun painted the hospital room in hues of pink and gold, a quiet contrast to the storm of emotions still swirling in Clara's heart. The tears had stopped flowing. Clara had cried her last tear for Lucas Davidson. As the discharge papers arrived, they carried with them another blow. Lucas had already contacted his lawyers. A manila envelope containing divorce papers, accompanied by a check that felt like a slap in the face, sat on the table. The attached note was brief. To help you get started. Don't contact me. Clara couldn't help but scoff at the irony. Lucas had abandoned them, and now he thought that a check could fix everything. But Clara was stronger now. She wouldn't let him control her. No, this was the moment she would take back her life. As Mary helped Clara pack up their things, Dr. Chin appeared once again, holding Sophie's final checkup paperwork. Her eyes were filled with concern, but there was something more there. Something unspoken. As if Dr. Chin knew the truth, knew what had really happened behind closed doors. Mrs. Romano, Dr. Chin said softly, pulling Clara aside, her voice low but firm. I want you to know that I documented everything, from Mr. Davidson's behavior to his abandonment. I've kept meticulous notes. You never know when they might be useful, but if you need anything, I'm here. Clara nodded, clutching Sophie close to her chest. The kindness in Dr. Chin's eyes was a lifeline. She didn't have to go through this alone, and that gave her the strength to keep moving forward. As Mary wheeled Clara out of the hospital, Clara felt the weight of the past year lift just a little. The doors she had once walked through with Lucas now opened into a future without him. One that would be shaped by her and Sophie. Sophie stirred in her bassinet, her little eyes blinking open, revealing deep pools of innocence and trust. She was all Clara had left, and Clara was all Sophie needed. They would be enough. Before I share what happened next, the moment that left an entire room of journalists in stunned silence, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight for something you believe in, hit that like button, because this story is just getting started. As the morning sun bathed the room in light, Clara knew that this was only the beginning. What Lucas had done to them would no longer be their story. This was their story now, and it was going to be a hell of a ride. The first year after Lucas left was a blur for Clara. The days melted together, marked only by the constant rhythm of Sophie's needs, the relentless cycle of feedings, diapers, and sleepless nights. There were no more quiet dinners, no more shared moments of excitement about the future. There was only Clara and Sophie, navigating a world that had suddenly turned cold and unforgiving. But through it all, Clara discovered something in herself she never knew existed, an inner strength that refused to bend or break, no matter how heavy the weight of the world seemed to be. First, it was hard to even leave the house. Clara spent many days in the small apartment she had found, feeling like the walls were closing in around her. Sophie, still so tiny, needed constant attention. She was a beautiful reminder of all the things Clara had once dreamed of: a family, love, a future together. But now, every smile from Sophie only deepened the pain of her father's abandonment. Clara would look into Sophie's wide eyes and feel the pang of grief that Lucas would never know the joy of watching his daughter grow. But it wasn't just the sadness that kept Clara from moving forward. It was the exhaustion, the never-ending cycle of caring for Sophie with no break, no reprieve. Clara learned quickly how to juggle it all. She became a master at multitasking, holding Sophie in one arm while typing with the other, answering emails and working on her resume in the few quiet moments Sophie allowed her. The exhaustion was overwhelming, but so was the fierce determination that grew with every day. She had no choice but to make it work. There was no room for failure, no option but to build a life for Sophie that was filled with love, stability, and hope. She started taking on freelance projects, small gigs that didn't pay much but allowed her to start rebuilding her career. The startup that James had introduced her to provided a lifeline, though it wasn't easy. Every day felt like a struggle to keep her head above water. She would set Sophie in her little bouncer beside her makeshift desk and balance client calls with diaper changes, scribbling notes on her laptop while making sure Sophie was entertained. The first few months were an exhausting blur of sleepless nights and caffeine-fueled days, but slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. It wasn't just the work that was hard. It was the emotional weight of everything that had happened. Every time Clara took a step forward, she felt Lucas's absence, like an ever-present shadow that followed her. He had left her without even trying to understand the pain he had caused, the life he had torn apart. But Clara refused to let his absence define her. She had Sophie to raise, and every time she looked at her daughter, the fire inside her grew stronger. Sophie didn't deserve to live in the shadows of someone else's mistakes. She deserved the world. And as the months passed, Clara began to build that world. The small apartment was modest, second-hand furniture, chipped paint, but it was theirs. Sophie's room, with its soft yellow walls and homemade blankets, was filled with the warmth of Clara's love and determination. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Clara would wake up every morning to the sound of Sophie's soft cooing, and that was enough to fuel her through the toughest of days. As time went on, Clara started finding small moments of joy again. She would sit by the window in the evenings, watching the sunset while Sophie napped beside her. She began meeting new people, other single mothers who understood the unique challenges she faced. Through them, Clara found a community, a network of women who had faced their own battles and come out stronger on the other side. Together, they shared stories, lent each other a hand when needed, and offered the kind of support that made Clara feel like she wasn't alone in the world. One evening, after a particularly grueling week of work, Clara stood in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal of pasta for herself and Sophie. As she stirred the pot, Sophie crawled into the room, giggling and reaching for Clara's hand. Clara paused, looking down at her daughter, her heart swelling with love. In that moment, everything felt right. She didn't need Lucas to feel complete. She had Sophie, and that was enough. They would build a life together, one step at a time. Before I continue with the next chapter of Clara's journey, I want to hear from you, my amazing viewers. What's the hardest thing you've ever had to overcome, and how did you do it? Share your story in the comments below, and if you've ever had a moment where you realize just how strong you truly are, hit that like button. It's time to keep going. As Clara sat down at her desk after dinner, the glow of the laptop screen illuminated her face. Sophie was in her crib, drifting off to sleep, her tiny body curled up peacefully. Clara took a deep breath, a sense of purpose filling her as she looked at the email she had just received. An offer for a full-time position at the startup James had introduced her to. It wasn't exactly the job she had left behind at Davidson Corp, but it was a start. It was the beginning of something new, something she could build on her own. The years of hard work were starting to pay off, and Clara could feel the momentum shifting. She was finally getting to a place where she could breathe again. But it wasn't just about the work, it was about her. She had become someone she didn't even recognize anymore. Strong, determined, resilient. And every day, she was more certain that nothing, not even the pain of Lucas's betrayal, could ever break her. For the first time in a long while, Clara believed in the future again. And it was one she would build, one step at a time with Sophie by her side. Clara had never imagined that the first real opportunity to rebuild her life would come in the form of a small email, a message that she almost missed while juggling Sophie's cries and a half-finished proposal for a new client. But when the subject line caught her eye, exciting opportunity, she hesitated just long enough to click it open. The words that greeted her on the screen made her pause, breathless for a moment. It was from James Cooper, her mentor, the man who had believed in her when no one else did. He had been a constant in her life, offering guidance without ever asking for anything in return. He had always been there when she needed advice or simply someone to talk to. The email was short but powerful, offering Clara a role at his new startup. An opportunity that would allow her to use her skills in a way that she hadn't imagined. The job wasn't anything like what she had left behind at Davidson Corp, but that was exactly what made it so exciting. This was her chance to start fresh, to redefine her career on her own terms. For a moment, Clara sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She knew what this meant. This was the first real step toward a new life, one that she could build without the shadow of Lucas or the past hanging over her. But the decision wasn't as simple as it seemed. She was still a single mother, still working tirelessly to make ends meet, and Sophie was her top priority. There were times when Clara felt as though she was spread too thin, like she couldn't give enough of herself to everything. But deep down, she knew that she couldn't let fear hold her back any longer. This opportunity was a lifeline, one that could change everything for both her and Sophie. The next day, Clara made the decision. She called James, her voice steady with the confidence she had been slowly cultivating over the past months. She accepted the offer, her heart pounding in her chest as she realized that this was it. The beginning of something new, something that had the potential to change the course of her life. The startup wasn't a giant corporation with a polished glass building, but there was a raw energy to it, a sense of possibility that Clara hadn't felt in years. The team was small, but they had big dreams, and they believed in Clara's skills and expertise. It wasn't the career she had envisioned before, one filled with boardrooms and corporate power, but it was exactly what she needed now. A chance to work on her own terms, to prove to herself that she could rise from the ashes of her old life and create something entirely her own. At first, the adjustment was overwhelming. Clara spent long hours in front of her laptop, working from the tiny apartment that still smelled of fresh paint. She was still breastfeeding, still juggling the demands of motherhood, and the balance was delicate. But with each passing day, she began to feel a spark inside her. Something she hadn't felt in years. She was alive with purpose again, not just as Sophie's mother, but as Clara, the woman who had a future she could shape. There were days when Clara felt like she was walking a tightrope, days when the weight of everything pressed down on her. But there was something powerful about this new path. It was hers. It wasn't defined by the betrayal of the past, nor was it overshadowed by the mistakes of others. It was a chance to define who she was on her own terms, and that made all the difference. In the evenings, when the house was quiet and Sophie was asleep, Clara would sit at the kitchen table, sipping on her cup of tea, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had done it, she had taken the first step. She had chosen herself, and in doing so, she had chosen the future she would create for Sophie. It wasn't easy, but nothing in life ever was. Every morning, as she sat in front of her laptop, Clara reminded herself that this was just the beginning. She had climbed out of the darkness of betrayal and rejection, and now she was walking towards something bright and full of possibility. With Sophie by her side, Clara felt unstoppable. No longer was she defined by the past or haunted by the ghost of Lucas's abandonment. She was Clara Romano, a mother, a woman, and now, a professional who would stop at nothing to build the life she and Sophie deserved. Before I share what happens next in Clara's journey, how she faced the challenges of balancing her career and motherhood, and the pivotal moment that changed everything, I want to hear from you, my incredible viewers. How do you balance your dreams with the challenges life throws at you? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts with me. And if you've ever had to fight for a second chance, hit that like button. Trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. As the days passed, Clara's confidence grew. She was no longer the woman who had been abandoned in the hospital room with nothing but her newborn daughter. She was a woman with a mission, with a vision for her future. And with each step, she was getting closer to the life she had always dreamed of. Not just for herself, but for Sophie, too. As Clara settled into her new role at the startup, she quickly realized that success wasn't just about her own hard work. It was about the people she surrounded herself with. She had always been a determined, self-sufficient person, but as the days grew longer and the demands of her new job, motherhood, and life as a single parent mounted, she understood the importance of building a strong support system. And, without even realizing it, that was exactly what she had started to do. The first piece of the puzzle was her team at the startup. The company was small, but the energy was contagious. Each team member brought something unique to the table, and Clara quickly found herself forming connections with them. Connections that would become as important to her as her own career. She wasn't just working for the company. She was building something with these people. Together, they were creating a vision, and Clara was right there in the thick of it, leading the charge. Mia, the marketing lead, was the first to truly understand Clara's vision. Mia had a spark, a raw energy that made her a natural at connecting with clients and making them feel heard. She was a little quirky, with her wild hair and colorful wardrobe, but there was no mistaking her sharp mind and unwavering commitment to the company's growth. She quickly became someone Clara could count on. They spent hours brainstorming, working late into the night, with Sophie occasionally snuggled in Clara's lap as they worked on campaigns and strategies. Mia didn't mind. She had seen Clara juggle it all, and it only made her more determined to help the company succeed. Then there was Tom, the quiet genius of the team. He was the one who could see the future in numbers, in spreadsheets and algorithms. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was with the kind of insight that made everyone stop and listen. Clara found herself turning to him whenever she hit a roadblock in her own thinking. He was methodical, precise, and he had a way of looking at problems from angles that Clara had never considered. Over time, Clara learned to trust Tom's instincts, his ability to find solutions in the chaos that often surrounded them. He never hesitated to jump in and help, even when it meant taking on more than his fair share of the workload. And then there was Sarah, the operations manager, who had a calm, steady presence that Clara had quickly grown to rely on. Sarah had a family of her own, and Clara admired her ability to balance it all so effortlessly. Sarah became more than just a colleague. She became a mentor, offering Clara advice not only on managing the company but on balancing the demands of being a mother and a professional. She was the one who helped Clara see that it was okay to ask for help, that it was okay to lean on others when the weight of everything became too much. Sarah's wisdom, combined with her warmth, made her someone Clara could trust completely. Together, the team became more than just a group of colleagues. They became a family. A family that understood the pressures Clara faced as a mother, a professional, and a woman navigating the complicated waters of life. They celebrated the small victories, the late-night wins, the moments of success that felt so much sweeter because they had done it together. The support Clara received from them wasn't just about work. It was about trust, compassion, and the belief that they could all achieve something incredible if they worked as a unit. They lifted each other up, shared the burden when it got too heavy, and celebrated the milestones together, no matter how small. And in return, Clara gave them everything she had. She was a leader, but she was also one of them, a part of the team fighting for the same vision, the same goal. As the months passed, Clara's confidence continued to grow. She was no longer just the woman who had been abandoned by her husband, left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. She was Clara Romano, a force to be reckoned with, resilient, driven, and surrounded by a team that had her back every step of the way. She had built something beautiful, something that was hers, with the help of the incredible people she had brought into her life. And in the quiet moments, when the office was empty and the team had gone home for the day, Clara would look around at the work they had accomplished together. The startup was growing. They were getting noticed. Their ideas were being heard. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about the legacy they were building one day at a time. And Clara, with the support of her team, was at the helm, steering them toward a future she had only dreamed of. Before I dive into the next chapter of Clara's journey, how she turned her team's collective vision into a reality that no one could ignore, I want to hear from you, my amazing viewers. Have you ever been part of a team that made you feel unstoppable? Share your story in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of building the right relationships to make a difference, hit that like button, because this story is far from over. As Clara sat in her office one evening, the weight of everything she had built settled over her like a warm embrace. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. And with her team by her side, there was no limit to what they could accomplish together. The best was yet to come. Clara had worked so hard to build the life she now had, one full of purpose, independence, and love for Sophie. The early mornings and sleepless nights had slowly turned into days filled with steady progress, and she had found a rhythm that worked for her and her daughter. She had created a world that, although not perfect, was hers. It was a world where Lucas's abandonment no longer held sway over her heart, a world where she was thriving in ways she hadn't imagined. But nothing in life ever stays still for long, and Clara was about to learn that the past had a way of resurfacing when you least expected it. The knock on the door came on a quiet evening, the kind of evening where the world outside seemed to slow down, the air crisp and still. Clara had just finished dinner with Sophie, the kitchen warm with the scent of pasta and garlic. Sophie was in the living room, playing with her favorite doll, laughing as she made it twirl around. Clara was about to settle into her favorite chair, ready to enjoy the calm of the night, when the knock echoed through the house. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. The last time someone had knocked at this door, it had been years ago when the apartment had felt too small, too quiet. A part of her had learned to embrace that quiet, to welcome it as a refuge from the chaos of the past. But this knock felt different. Clara's breath caught as she walked to the door. Her hand hovered over the handle, her mind racing through 1,000 possibilities. She knew who it was before she even opened the door. There he was, Lucas. Time had not been kind to him. His hair was graying at the temples, his face thinner, more lined. The sharpness that had once marked his every move was gone, replaced by a weariness that ran deep. His eyes, those eyes that once held so much promise, now seemed tired, haunted. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lucas stood there, his hands trembling slightly at his sides, as if unsure of how to begin. The weight of the years between them hung in the air, thick with the memories of a life they had once shared and lost. Clara's heart tightened in her chest. She had moved on, found peace, found purpose. And yet, seeing him there, standing on the other side of the door, made everything she had worked so hard to build feel fragile, uncertain. "Sophie is in the other room," Clara said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "What do you want, Lucas?" He flinched at the words, as though they were a slap to his face. But he didn't retreat. He didn't look away. Instead, he took a deep breath and stepped into the doorway, the weight of the moment palpable between them. "I know I don't deserve to be here," Lucas began, his voice hoarse, rough with emotion. "But I need to say something. I need to explain." Clara's chest tightened, her thoughts spinning in a haze. He had walked away from her. He had rejected Sophie. How could there possibly be an explanation for that? For years, she had thought about the day he had abandoned them. She had played it over in her mind 1,000 times, wondered if there was something she could have done differently, something she could have said to make him stay. But now, standing before him, it all seemed so distant, so irrelevant. She had built a life without him. A life that she was proud of. "You don't get to explain yourself, Lucas," Clara said, the sharpness in her voice surprising even her. "You made your choice. You walked away. You left us." He looked at her, his eyes filled with regret, and for the first time in a long while, Clara saw the man she had once loved, vulnerable, raw, and full of remorse. But there was no part of her that was willing to let him back into her life. Not now. Not after everything. "I know I did," Lucas said softly, his voice breaking as he spoke. "But I was wrong. I was terrified. I thought I couldn't be a father. I thought—" His voice faltered, and he swallowed hard, as if the words he was speaking were choking him. "I thought I couldn't give you what you needed, what Sophie needed." Clara stood there, frozen, as his words washed over her. She had known it deep down. The insecurities, the doubts, the reasons behind his departure. But to hear him say it, to hear him admit it so plainly, was a bitter pill to swallow. "You thought you couldn't give us what we needed?" Clara repeated, her voice barely a whisper, the hurt rising inside her. "You didn't even try, Lucas. You didn't even try." There was a long pause. Lucas seemed to shrink under her gaze, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of his own guilt was finally too much to bear. I know, he whispered. "I was a coward. I couldn't face my own fears, and I pushed you both away. I hurt you, and I will never forgive myself for that." Clara's mind raced, her heart torn between the memories of the man she had once loved and the father who had abandoned their daughter without a second thought. Sophie was her world now. She had spent years trying to protect her, trying to build something good out of the wreckage Lucas had left behind. She couldn't just let him waltz back into their lives. But then, as Clara looked into his eyes, something inside her shifted. The anger, the resentment. It was still there, simmering beneath the surface. But so was something else. The realization that, in some way, Lucas was still her past. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to face it, to confront it head-on so that she and Sophie could move forward without looking back. "Why now?" Clara asked quietly. "Why after all this time? Why come back now when Sophie is... when we're finally okay?" "I don't deserve forgiveness," Lucas said, his voice breaking. "But I'm dying, Clara. I have cancer. Stage 4. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less." He paused, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. "I need to make things right. Not for me, but for Sophie. I need her to know the truth." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The anger that had flared inside her a moment ago seemed to fade, replaced by something else, something more complicated. Lucas's return, his admission, his vulnerability, it was too much to process all at once. Before she could respond, Sophie appeared at the door, her eyes wide with curiosity as she looked at the man standing in the hallway. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Sophie had never met Lucas. She didn't know him, not really. She was a child, a young woman now who had been raised without him. But Clara couldn't ignore the way Sophie's gaze lingered on him. The curiosity, the unspoken question. "Who is this, Mom?" Sophie asked, her voice quiet, steady. Clara turned to look at her daughter, her heart swelling with pride. Sophie was strong, stronger than she had ever been at her age. Clara had raised her alone. But in that moment, she realized just how much Sophie had grown, how much of Clara's strength she had inherited. And somehow, someway, they had survived the unthinkable. "This is your father," Clara said, her voice calm but firm. "And it's time you hear the truth." Before I continue with Clara and Sophie's journey, how they decide to face the truth together and what happens next, I want to hear from you, my amazing viewers. Have you ever been faced with a difficult decision about someone you loved? What did you do? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've ever had to find strength in an the room was silent, the air thick with tension as Clara, Sophie, and Lucas stood at the threshold of a confrontation that had been 15 years in the making. Sophie, who had just learned the identity of the man standing before her, shifted uncomfortably but stood tall, her gaze unwavering. Clara's chest tightened, not just with anger, but with the weight of everything she had fought to build over the years. Sophie's voice broke the silence first. "You left us," she said quietly, the words filled with both confusion and hurt. "Why?" Clara watched as Lucas's face softened, the guilt in his eyes undeniable. His hands trembled slightly at his sides, but he didn't look away from Sophie's piercing gaze. The truth had been a long time coming, and it was clear that Lucas was about to face the consequences of his past actions, no matter how much he wished for a different outcome. I thought I wasn't good enough," Lucas started, his voice hoarse, breaking with emotion. "I was afraid I wouldn't be able to give you what you needed, Clara. Afraid of failing as a father, failing as a husband. When I saw those messages from James, I believed the worst. I thought that I wasn't the father you needed, that you didn't want me, that you were better off without me." Clara's heart clenched as she listened. She had heard the echo of his doubts in the years since he left, but to hear him admit them now, so openly and vulnerably, stirred a storm of emotions within her. It was too late for these confessions, too late for the apologies. And yet, there was something raw in his voice, something that reminded Clara of the man she had once loved. "I wanted to be the man you needed," Lucas continued, his voice breaking even more. "But I couldn't face it. I was so consumed by my own fears that I ran. And He faltered, his breath shaky, as if the weight of his own words was suffocating him. "I never stopped thinking about you, about both of you, but I never knew how to come back. I was too ashamed." Sophie, who had been standing silently, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, spoke again. "And now you want us to believe that after all this time, after walking away, you're sorry? You think that's enough to make everything right?" Lucas winced at the words, but Sophie's anger was justified. The pain of abandonment, the betrayal of a father who had never returned, was not something that could be healed with a few words. Sophie's voice, though calm, carried the weight of years spent growing up without a father, without the support that most children took for granted. Clara could see the storm brewing behind Sophie's eyes, the same storm that had lived within her for so many years. "I don't expect forgiveness," Lucas said quietly, his voice full of regret. "I don't deserve it, but I need you both to know the truth about why I left, the truth about what I did." Clara took a deep breath, her thoughts spinning as she stared at the man who had once been her everything, the man who had walked out of her life without a second thought. She had spent so many years building her own strength, her own sense of self-worth, but seeing Lucas here, seeing him unravel in front of her, was a reminder of how fragile everything still was. "You made your choice," Clara said, her voice firm, yet tinged with sadness. "You chose to leave, and in doing so, you chose to abandon us. You chose to believe the lies instead of trusting us. And now you expect us to fix that? To just welcome you back with open arms?" Lucas's eyes filled with tears as he nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of Clara's words. "I know. I didn't trust you. I didn't trust myself. And I've regretted that every single day since. But it's too late for apologies, I know that. I only want you to understand, Sophie especially, why I did what I did." Sophie's face was unreadable as she took a step forward. She was no longer the little girl who had been abandoned in the hospital room. She had grown into a young woman, fierce and resilient, with a strength that Clara had never fully realized. Sophie had inherited Clara's spirit, and in that moment, it was clear that nothing would break her. Not even the man who had once called himself her father. "I don't need your apology," Sophie said softly, her voice steady. "I don't need you to fix it. I just needed you to show up. But you didn't. And I can't pretend that doesn't matter." The room fell silent again, the weight of Sophie's words settling heavily on everyone. Clara felt a sense of pride surge through her as she watched her daughter stand her ground. Sophie had learned from the best. She had learned the value of her own strength, and now she was using it to face the truth that Lucas had never been there, and that he couldn't change the past. Lucas, too, seemed to understand. He didn't try to justify himself anymore. There were no more excuses, no more attempts to explain away the years he had lost. All that remained was the raw reality of the situation, the simple truth that he had abandoned his family, and that he could not undo the damage. "I'm sorry," Lucas said one last time, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for everything. I know I can't make it right, but I want you both to know that I love you. I've always loved you. I didn't know how to fix my mistakes." Clara stood in the doorway, watching as Sophie processed the words, her expression unreadable. She could see the conflict in her daughter's eyes, the part of her that wanted to believe that people could change, that maybe there was some hope for redemption. But Clara knew better. She knew that forgiveness, real forgiveness, was not something that could be given just because someone asked for it. It had to be earned. And Lucas had spent too many years running from his responsibilities to expect anything in return. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," Sophie said quietly, her gaze shifting to Clara. "But I do know this. I've learned how to take care of myself, and I know that I'm enough, even without you." Clara reached out, placing a hand on Sophie's shoulder. She had raised her daughter to be strong, to never depend on anyone to define her worth. And now, standing in the presence of the man who had left them both behind, Clara realized that Sophie had become everything she had ever hoped she would be. She was more than enough. They both were. Lucas stood there, silently, as Clara and Sophie shared a quiet moment. He had come seeking redemption, but it was clear now that redemption was something he couldn't offer them. What mattered now was the life they had built, the future they were creating together. And no matter how many apologies Lucas offered, it would never change the fact that the past was behind them. Sophie stood silently, her eyes never leaving Lucas as he stood in the doorway, the weight of his apologies hanging in the air between them. Clara could see the struggle inside her daughter, the inner turmoil of wanting to find closure, wanting to understand, but also the fierce, quiet resolve that had grown in Sophie over the years. The girl who had once been a newborn in Clara's arms, vulnerable and innocent, had become a young woman with an unshakable sense of self. Sophie had inherited more than just her mother's looks. She had inherited her strength, her resilience, and now, as she faced Lucas, Clara could see the depth of her maturity. "Sophie," Lucas said softly, his voice trembling, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I can't undo what I did, but I need you to know that I love you, that I always have." Sophie stood motionless for a moment, her gaze unwavering. Clara held her breath, not sure what Sophie would say, but knowing that whatever came next, it would be a reflection of the young woman Sophie had become. The hurt that had lived within Clara for so long, the echo of betrayal and abandonment, was now a distant part of the past, something they had moved beyond. But for Sophie, it was still raw, still fresh, like a wound that had never quite healed. "I don't need your love, Lucas," Sophie said quietly, but with a strength that made Clara's heart swell with pride. "I've had enough love in my life from my mom, from the people who actually stayed. You walked away, and I learned how to stand without you. I had to." Lucas's face faltered as Sophie's words struck him with a force he wasn't prepared for. Clara saw the way his shoulders slumped, as though the years of guilt had finally caught up with him, but Sophie didn't soften her stance. "I spent so many years wishing you would come back," Sophie continued, her voice steady, her words more powerful than any anger. "I wanted to believe you would show up one day and make everything better. But you never did. And it's not about me anymore, Lucas. It's about the person I've become without you." Clara couldn't help but feel a wave of admiration for her daughter. Sophie wasn't just confronting her father's absence. She was owning her own story. She had been forced to grow up faster than any child should, but it hadn't broken her. Instead, it had forged a strength in her that was impossible to ignore. Sophie wasn't the child Lucas had abandoned. She was a young woman who had built her own life, her own sense of worth, and no one, not even the man who had left her behind, could take that away. "I'm proud of you, Sophie," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. She stepped forward and placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Sophie glanced up at her mother, her eyes filled with a quiet strength that left Clara in awe. "I know, Mom," Sophie said softly, a small smile tugging at her lips, I don't need him to tell me he's sorry. I don't need him to fix things. I've done that for myself. We've done that for ourselves. Lucas's eyes filled with tears, but there was no longer any trace of anger or resentment in Sophie's voice. Her words were measured, calm, like a quiet declaration of independence. Clara could see the shift, the way Sophie had come into her own power. No longer was she the little girl waiting for a father's love or validation. She was the woman who had learned to love herself, who had found strength in the absence of the man who should have been there. Sophie turned to Lucas one last time, her expression softening, not with forgiveness, but with a quiet acceptance. You can't fix the past, but you don't need to. I've learned that the hard way. Clara's heart swelled as she watched Sophie let go of something she had carried for so long. The anger, the disappointment, they were still there, but they no longer defined Sophie. Sophie had come to understand something fundamental, that she was not defined by the people who failed her, but by the way she chose to move forward. And as she stood there, in front of Lucas, Clara realized that Sophie had become everything she had always hoped for. Strong, independent, and unshakably resilient. I think it's time you leave, Lucas, Sophie said quietly, her tone no longer angry but resolute. We've said everything that needs to be said. Lucas nodded, his eyes downcast as he turned to leave. As he stepped out the door, the finality of his departure felt different this time. It wasn't just an end, it was a release, a letting go. Sophie had finally freed herself from the weight of a father who had never shown up when she needed him, and in doing so, she had found her own strength, her own sense of purpose. Clara watched as Sophie stood in the doorway, her back straight, her face calm but strong. Sophie had faced the ghosts of her past, and now, for the first time in her life, she was truly free. The pain was still there, of course, but it no longer held power over her. Sophie had grown into someone Clara could be endlessly proud of, and it was clear now that no matter what the future held, Sophie was going to face it on her own terms. The days following Lucas's departure were filled with a quiet kind of peace that Clara hadn't realized she was missing. It wasn't that the pain of the past had disappeared entirely, but there was a sense of resolution now. Sophie had spoken her truth, and Clara had done the same. The weight that had settled on Clara's chest for years was finally beginning to lift. She could breathe easier, feel the promise of a new beginning in the air. Even as she watched the pieces of her past continue to fade, Sophie too seemed lighter. She had let go of so much of the resentment, the yearning for a father who would never show up, the fear that something was wrong with her because of his absence. And now Clara saw her daughter with new eyes. The young woman before her was strong, poised, and unafraid to face the world head-on. Sophie had chosen to forgive herself, to let go of the story that Lucas had written for her all those years ago. She was ready to write her own. But while Clara had found her peace, she knew the road ahead would not be without its challenges. They still had a long way to go. Sophie was on her way to college soon, and Clara would have to navigate a new chapter of her life without the constant presence of her daughter. And yet, Clara found herself excited for what the future could bring. They had faced their darkest hours, and now they were stepping into the light. The day Sophie left for college, Clara watched her daughter walk away from their apartment with a suitcase in hand, ready to take on the world. Clara felt a mix of pride and sadness wash over her. She had always known this day would come, but it didn't make it any easier. Sophie had grown into someone she could no longer protect in the way she once had. But Clara knew it was time. Sophie was ready. Sophie was more than enough on her own. As she watched her daughter drive off, Clara stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. There was a new sense of purpose rising in her heart. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It wasn't just about getting by. Clara had something she had never had before, a future that was entirely her own. With Sophie gone, Clara found herself at a crossroads in her career, too. The startup had taken off, the company growing at a pace that was both exhilarating and overwhelming. She had the opportunity to take it even further, to become more than just a part of the team, but a true leader in her own right. The work was challenging, but Clara knew it was exactly where she was meant to be. She had poured everything into this company, just as she had poured everything into raising Sophie. And now, it was her time to step into the spotlight, to claim the success she had always dreamed of. But the most important thing Clara realized was that she didn't need anyone else's validation anymore. Not from Lucas, not from anyone. She had built this life on her own. The strength she had discovered within herself, the resilience that had kept her moving forward despite everything that had been thrown her way, it was all hers. And in that moment, Clara realized that the most important lesson she had learned was not just how to survive, but how to thrive no matter what. As the months passed, Clara threw herself into her work. She made the company her own, transforming it from a small startup into a force in the industry. She took risks, pushed boundaries, and found herself doing things she had never imagined. She became a mentor to others, offering the same support and guidance that James had once given her. She built a network of women who supported each other, who lifted each other up, and who refused to be silenced. In the quiet moments, when the office was empty and the world outside seemed far away, Clara would take a deep breath and reflect on everything that had led her here. It was a life she had never expected, one that had been forged in the fire of betrayal and abandonment, but one that was richer and more meaningful than she could have ever dreamed. She had learned to trust herself, to believe in her own strength, and to know that no matter what came next, she would be okay. And then, one day, as she sat in her office, looking out the window at the city below, Clara received an email that would change everything. It was from a major investor who had been watching the company's growth. They wanted to partner with her, to take her business to the next level. The deal would be big, life-changing big. But Clara didn't hesitate. She knew exactly what she wanted. She wanted to make sure the company stayed true to its roots. She wanted to make sure it never lost sight of the values that had gotten her to this point. As she signed the contract, Clara knew that this was her moment. This was the moment she had been working toward for years. It wasn't just about the money or the success. It was about everything she had learned along the way, the strength, the resilience, and the unwavering belief that she was worthy of all the good things that were coming her way. And so, Clara moved forward, not with anger or bitterness, but with a quiet, unshakable confidence. She knew that she had built something beautiful out of the ashes of her past. And in doing so, she had shown Sophie and herself that the best revenge isn't in destroying what hurt us, but in creating something far greater than we ever imagined. The journey had not been easy, but it had been hers. And now, as Clara looked ahead to the future, she knew that the best was yet to come. A year had passed since the day Lucas had shown up at their door, and life had continued to unfold in ways that Clara had never imagined. Sophie was now away at college, thriving in a new environment, surrounded by friends who saw her for who she truly was: strong, independent, and unapologetically herself. Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of pride every time she spoke to Sophie on the phone, hearing about her achievements, her challenges, and the ways in which Sophie had continued to grow into the remarkable young woman Clara had always known she would be. And Clara? She had built a life that was hers, not just in the sense of career or personal success, but in a deeper way. She had found a peace within herself that had once seemed so far out of reach. Every day was a reminder of how far she had come. Every day was a testament to the strength she had discovered after years of being tested by the harshest of circumstances. Her work at the startup had flourished. The company was now a leading name in its field, and Clara had risen through the ranks, becoming not just a part of it, but its heartbeat. She had nurtured a culture of collaboration, empowerment, and resilience, values that reflected her own journey. She had become a mentor to many, just as James Cooper had once been to her, offering support and guidance to those who needed it most. She had built a team not just of employees but of people who believed in her vision, who believed in the mission, and who had become her family. Together, they celebrated every small victory, every milestone, and every step forward. As she sat in her office one afternoon, looking out at the bustling city below, Clara took a deep breath. It had been a long road to get here, full of setbacks, heartbreak, and moments of doubt. But it had also been full of triumph, love, and the kind of growth that only comes when you refuse to give up. Clara had made a name for herself, not by seeking revenge, but by building something that mattered. And as she watched her daughter step into the world with the same determination that Clara had learned to cultivate, she realized that her legacy wasn't just about the work she had done, but about the woman she had become, and the way she had taught Sophie to believe in herself, to trust her own strength, and to never settle for less than she deserved. One evening, after a long day of meetings and calls, Clara walked into her apartment, a place that felt more like home now than it ever had before. It wasn't the grandest place, but it was filled with love, memories, and the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing she had created something meaningful. She looked around the room, taking in the photographs of Sophie and the small mementos scattered around, each one a reminder of the journey they had shared. As she sat down at the kitchen table, Clara picked up her phone, her fingers hesitating for just a moment before she dialed Sophie's number. She didn't need to speak. They both knew the unspoken bond between them. When Sophie answered, her voice bright and full of excitement, Clara felt the familiar warmth in her chest. "How's everything going, sweetheart?" Clara asked, her voice full of affection. "I'm doing great, Mom. Classes are intense, but I'm loving it here. I've made some amazing friends, and I've been volunteering with a local nonprofit. It feels good to give back, you know?" Clara smiled softly, pride swelling in her heart. Sophie had always been driven, always been someone who wanted to make a difference. She had inherited that from Clara. Only Sophie had taken it even further, channeling her energy into something bigger than herself. "That's amazing, sophomore. I'm so proud of you. I knew you were meant for something great." Sophie's voice softened, her tone sincere. "Thanks, Mom. I wouldn't be here without you. You taught me everything I need to know." The words were simple, but they carried so much weight. Clara's heart swelled with emotion, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to slow down. She had done it. She had raised a daughter who was strong, compassionate, and who would one day change the world in ways that no one could yet imagine. And in doing so, she had given Sophie the tools to navigate her own journey, just as Clara had found her own way, despite the odds stacked against her. As they said their goodbyes, Clara hung up the phone, a deep sense of fulfillment washing over her. She had built a legacy not just through her career, but through the life she had created with Sophie. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't always easy, but it was real, it was theirs, and it was enough. Clara sat back in her chair, looking out at the skyline, feeling a sense of peace she had never known before. The past had shaped her, yes, but it no longer defined her. It had been the catalyst for her transformation, but she had become something more, something stronger, something more whole. The road she had traveled had been long, but it had brought her to this moment, this life, and she was ready for whatever came next. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara took one final look at the city lights twinkling in the distance. It wasn't just the end of a day, it was the beginning of something even greater. Her journey, and Sophie's, was far from over, and Clara knew, without a doubt, that the best chapters were yet to be written. In that moment, Clara realized that her legacy wasn't defined by the past, by what had been taken from her, but by what she had created, by the life she had built with love, perseverance, and an unwavering belief in the power of second chances. The future was theirs to shape, and no one, not even the shadows of the past, could take that away from them.